Dante Wilder wasn't a warrior. He was a Conman. It was the one truth he held on to as he slipped through the flickering doors of Zantar 5, the galaxy's most dangerous tournament arena. Beneath his feet was the sprawling combat floor where the greatest warriors from across the stars would clash for glory, wealth, and fame. But Dante wasn't one of them. Today, he wasn't a shadowy con artist hiding in the darkness. Today, he was a hero from the solar belt, a legendary fighter, at least according to the fabricated stats on his badge. The holographic emblem gleamed, a symbol of deceit. The dim lights of the tournament arena cast eerie reflections off his custom-tailored combat suit, the illusion of a warrior. Every step he took echoed through the hallway, a sound that seemed amplified by the pulse of adrenaline running through his veins. The walls were cold, metallic, and unforgiving, just like the life he was trying to escape. Then, there was the sound, the unmistakable click of approaching footsteps. Official guards, their eyes sharp and cold, moved through the hall like machines. They were looking for trouble. But what they didn't know was that they were walking right past it. They were looking for anyone who could disrupt the system. But Dante wasn't just any competitor. He was an imposter, a fraud, and if they found him out, it was over. Dante froze, pressing his back against the cold metal wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he didn't have time for fear. One wrong move, one slip-up, and everything would come crashing down. He held his breath, listening to the footsteps drawing closer. "Don't panic, Dante," he whispered to himself, his voice steady, but internally he could feel his pulse racing. "Just smile, look the part, and they'll never suspect a thing." Beside him, Orion, his spherical droid companion, hovered silently. Its single red sensor flickered as it scanned the area. The probability of detection is 47.3%. It would be wise to abort before it's too late. Dante smirked, though it was more out of habit than confidence. "No going back, Orion. We're already this deep. 10 million credits and membership in the Galactic Warrior Brotherhood is on the line. If we succeed, we can finally get out of the gutter. No more scams, no more running from debts. We'll be set." Orion remained silent for a moment, its sensor narrowing. "Should the operation fail, your credit history will be sold to Corellian debt collectors. They would pay a significant amount for your records." Dante felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Yeah, thanks for the reminder," he muttered under his breath. But the path was set, and he had no choice but to keep moving forward. As the guards passed without noticing him, he exhaled quietly, a rush of relief flooding through him. But it wouldn't last long. He could already hear the thrum of the arena, the roar of the crowd in the distance, and the undeniable pressure of his deception about to unravel. A voice suddenly called out from behind him. "Solar Belt Phantom? Is that you?" Dante turned, his heart skipping a beat. Standing in front of him was a tall official from Zantar 5, datapad in hand, scanning him with piercing eyes. The official's gaze felt like it could see through him, like he was already exposed. The tension was suffocating. "Yes, that's me," Dante replied, forcing the words out with a calmness he didn't feel. His mind raced. This was it, the moment everything could fall apart. Would this be the end of his carefully constructed lie, or would he pull it off? The official glanced at the datapad. "Your combat records are unusual. No official matches in the system." Dante's heart skipped a beat. He tried to keep his composure, gripping the handle of his practice sword. "My techniques were passed down through a sacred lineage," he said, hoping the words would sound convincing enough. "I fight not for glory, but for the purity of combat." The official exchanged a glance with his colleague, then nodded slowly. "Interesting. However, all competitors must undergo biometric scanning." Dante's blood ran cold. The biometric scan would reveal everything: his lack of combat experience, his complete absence of physical prowess. He couldn't let that happen. I can't undergo such invasive procedures," he stammered, praying his excuse would hold up. The official's brow furrowed. "Tournament regulations require it." Before he could protest further, Orion came through, projecting a fabricated document from the Galactic Warrior Brotherhood. "This special dispensation from the Brotherhood should clarify the situation," Orion said, its voice as calm as ever. The official studied the document for a long moment before reluctantly nodding. "This is highly irregular, but we'll allow it." Dante exhaled a deep breath, barely suppressing his relief. His heart was still racing, but he had made it through. For now, Dante couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closing in. After his easy victory in the first match, thanks to his opponent taking a dive for the right price, he thought he'd pulled it off. But as the moments passed, he realized that this tournament wasn't just about winning battles. Here, everything was monitored, and one slip-up could expose him for what he truly was. As he moved into the preparation area for his next match, he caught a few officials eyeing him with subtle suspicion. Their glances weren't casual, they were studying him, taking in every detail of his posture, every movement. It was clear they were starting to doubt his identity. Dante felt a wave of unease, but he kept his face neutral. He had to maintain the illusion. One wrong move, one wrong word, and the entire facade would collapse. One of the officials approached, his sharp eyes scanning Dante like he was a criminal under investigation. "Solar Belt Phantom?" the official asked, his voice cool and detached. "That's me," Dante replied, forcing calm into his tone. His mind raced. This was it, the moment of truth. Would his disguise hold, or would everything unravel here? The official glanced down at his datapad, eyes narrowing slightly. "Your combat records, they're unusual. No matches recorded in any of the systems." Dante's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't flinch. "My techniques were passed down through a sacred lineage," he said, putting on his best enigmatic warrior face. "I fight not for glory, but for the purity of combat." The official studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable, before giving a small nod. "Interesting. However, all competitors are required to undergo biometric scanning." Dante's blood ran cold. The biometric scan would expose everything: his complete lack of combat experience, his lack of physical prowess. He couldn't let that happen. I cannot undergo such invasive procedures," Dante stammered, trying to sound convincing. The official raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Tournament regulations are clear. We have to." Before the official could continue, Orion intervened, projecting a document from the Galactic Warrior Brotherhood. "This special dispensation from the Brotherhood should clarify the matter," Orion said flatly. The official hesitated, examining the document for a moment, then gave a reluctant nod. "This is highly irregular, but we will allow it." Dante exhaled a quiet breath of relief. For now, the deception held, but the momentary respite did little to ease the pressure building in his chest. He knew this was only the beginning. The real battle had only just started. Dante moved through the corridors of the tournament arena, trying to keep his composure. He had made it through the first test, but he could feel eyes on him. There was something in the air, something that made him feel as if he were walking on the edge of a blade. The tournament might be about fighting, but it was also about politics, reputation, and power. And there was one person in particular who could make everything far more complicated than it needed to be. He caught sight of her across the arena, a tall, striking figure standing in the royal viewing section. Mira Solis, princess of the Leonid people, was not just a ruler, but a warrior in her own right. Her regal posture and the way she carried herself exuded silent power that even Dante, a con man with experience in reading people, couldn't ignore. Dante tried to avoid her gaze, but it was impossible. Her eyes met his, and in that brief moment, he felt as if she could see straight through him. He wasn't just another fighter to her. To Mira, Dante was an enigma, and that was something she couldn't ignore. As the match ended, Dante was making his way back to the preparation area when he found himself stepping in the direction of Mira. She had already risen, her commanding presence radiating from her every move. Her silver tail swayed gracefully behind her, a reminder of the strength she carried within. When she turned her head and locked eyes with him, a sharp silence fell over the space between them. Dante was aware of every muscle in his body tightening under her scrutiny. She approached him, her voice smooth but with an edge that made it impossible to ignore. "You're a curious one," she said, her eyes scanning him, assessing him. "The Phantom of the Solar Belt. I've never heard of you." Dante felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to smile. "Every warrior has a story, princess," he replied, adding a slight touch of mystery to his tone. "Some of us are just more elusive." Mira studied him for a long moment, her gaze never wavering. Then, with a faint, knowing smile, she turned and walked away without another word. Dante stood frozen for a moment, watching her leave. There was something in the way she looked at him, something that made him feel as if she knew exactly who he was, perhaps more than he wanted her to. She was no ordinary princess. Mira Solis wasn't just royalty. She was a warrior, and warriors like her weren't easily fooled. Dante's mind raced. He had to keep up the act, but it wouldn't be easy. Mira was not someone who could be deceived for long, and that was the last thing he needed right now. As Dante prepared for his second match, the sense of danger only grew. He had barely made it through the first fight without raising suspicion, but the pressure was mounting. The officials, the spectators, even the other fighters, they were all watching him closely. He could feel their eyes on him, the way they studied him as he moved through the halls and corridors of the arena. His every step felt heavier than the last. He had always been good at keeping his cool, at pretending to be someone he wasn't. But here, in this vast arena filled with warriors who had earned their places, it felt different. His heart beat a little faster, his palms a little sweatier. The act wasn't just exhausting, it was starting to feel like it was suffocating him. The longer he stayed in the tournament, the more likely it was that his secret would be exposed. Orion, ever the voice of reason, hovered beside him as usual. Its red sensor flickered as it scanned Dante's face. "Your anxiety is rising, Dante. The probability of exposure increases with each moment of hesitation." "I know, Orion," Dante muttered under his breath, walking toward the next combat arena. His mind raced. "But there's no turning back now. I've come this far, and I'm not about to back out just because things are getting uncomfortable." Orion's mechanical voice remained calm, almost clinical. "The next opponent is the Orion Champion. If you do not fight with authenticity, you will be exposed." Dante clenched his jaw. The Orion Champion was legendary for his brutal, unforgiving combat style. Even with his opponent on the take, Dante knew that this would be his biggest challenge yet. The pressure was overwhelming, but as he approached the entrance to the next arena, he felt something more than just fear. It was the sting of his own lies, eating away at him. He had been running from his past for so long, using deception as a shield. But now, as he stepped into the ring, that shield felt like it was cracking. "Just get through it, Dante," he whispered to himself. "One more fight, and we're out." He wasn't sure if it was the adrenaline or the weight of the moment, but for the first time, he felt his heart race for reasons beyond the thrill of the fight. He wasn't just trying to survive the tournament anymore. He was trying to survive himself. As Dante entered the ring for the second match, the crowd's roar was deafening, but it only heightened his sense of isolation. His opponent, the Orion Champion, stood across from him, a hulking, 7-foot-tall warrior with 6 muscular arms, each wielding a different weapon. His eyes gleamed with deadly intent, and the mere sight of him made the arena feel like a tomb. Dante had heard of the Orion Champion's reputation. In the past, no opponent had lasted more than 30 seconds against him. The stakes of this fight were higher than anything he had faced before. This wasn't just about survival anymore. If he couldn't win here, his entire plan would crumble. "Prepare to die, human," the Orion Champion sneered, his voice deep and menacing. He raised his 6 weapons, each one gleaming in the arena lights. Dante steadied himself, recalling the fake techniques he had studied, the moves he had meticulously practiced in the hopes of fooling the crowd. He knew how to dodge, how to move in unpredictable ways, but nothing could prepare him for the raw power of his opponent. The match began with a deafening gong, and the Orion Champion charged forward. Dante narrowly avoided the first blow, but the sheer force of it sent him stumbling back. The crowd roared in excitement, misinterpreting his desperation as skillful evasion. He tried to regain his footing, but the pressure was immense. As the champion's 6 arms came down on him, each strike harder than the last, Dante's mind raced. His heart pounded in his chest as he barely dodged a blow aimed at his head. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the cold panic setting in. Every movement felt wrong. Every dodge felt like a mistake. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be fighting for real. In the distance, through the chaos of the battle, Dante spotted Mira Solis standing in the royal box, her eyes locked on him. He couldn't tell if she was impressed or simply studying him with the cold detachment of a warrior who could see through any facade. The thought of her watching him only added to the suffocating pressure. He had to keep up the act. He couldn't afford to let her or anyone see through him now. Focus, he muttered to himself, barely avoiding another attack. Just focus. But with every move, his disguise felt more fragile. The audience cheered, convinced by his chaotic and unpredictable style. But Dante knew the truth. He was nothing like the warrior they believed him to be. The Orion Champion wasn't taking a dive. He was trying to kill him. And with every blow, Dante's worst fears came closer to being realized. Dante paced nervously in the darkened corridors of Zantar 5, his mind racing. The tournament was in full swing, and with every passing minute, the pressure weighed heavier on him. His first match had been easy, a quick victory that came with minimal effort, but the stakes were rising. The further he went into the tournament, the more he felt the danger of his deception looming over him. He couldn't escape the gnawing feeling in his chest, the overwhelming sense that his lie was starting to unravel. He had convinced the officials, charmed the crowd, and avoided detection so far, but it was only a matter of time before someone would see through him. His movements had been erratic, his style unrefined, and yet, somehow, the audience had bought into it. But it wasn't enough to fool the other competitors. He knew that. As he approached the arena for his second match, the roar of the crowd hit him like a wave. The excitement, the energy, it was palpable. And for the first time, Dante didn't feel that rush of adrenaline. Instead, he felt sick to his stomach. His heart pounded, not with excitement, but with dread. The next opponent was the Orion Champion, a legendary fighter who had never lost a match. Dante wasn't prepared for this. He had been relying on luck, on deception, and now he was facing a true warrior. The thought of fighting him, of being exposed for the fraud that he was, sent a wave of panic through him. Orion, his droid companion, hovered silently beside him, its red optical sensor glowing faintly. Dante, your heart rate indicates excessive anxiety. The probability of exposure has increased by 28% since the last match. I know, Dante muttered under his breath, but there's no way out now. Orion's voice was flat, unfeeling. The Orion Champion will test your abilities to their limits. He is no pawn, Dante. This match will reveal the truth. Dante swallowed hard. The truth. He had been avoiding it for too long. But now, there was no escaping it. He wasn't a fighter. He was a con man, pretending to be someone he wasn't. And sooner or later, that lie would catch up with him. As the doors to the arena opened, the loud cheer of the crowd surged around him. Dante stepped onto the battlefield, his legs heavy, his mind racing. Across the ring stood the Orion Champion, 7 feet of pure muscle, 6 arms each holding a different weapon. His eyes were cold, calculating, and as he locked eyes with Dante, a chill ran down his spine. Prepare to die, human, the Orion Champion growled, his voice deep and menacing. Dante's breath caught in his throat. He knew that this fight was not going to be like the first one. This wasn't some rigged match where his opponent had agreed to take a dive. This was real. This was his worst nightmare. The gong sounded, and the battle began. Dante barely had time to react as the Orion Champion lunged at him, swinging a massive blade toward his head. He sidestepped just in time, the blade cutting through the air with a sound that sent shivers down Dante's spine. The crowd cheered, but Dante didn't hear them. His mind was too focused on the fight, or rather, on the fear of being exposed. Every move he made felt awkward, unnatural. His so-called unpredictable combat style was anything but. It was clumsy, forced, and he could see the confusion in the Orion Champion's eyes. He wasn't buying it. Orion's voice cut through his thoughts. Probability of success has dropped to 47%. The Orion Champion will recognize your lack of skill soon. Dante gritted his teeth. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. He had to keep going, had to keep up the charade for just a little longer. Amidst the chaos of the battle, Dante's eyes briefly flicked to the royal box. There, seated among the high-ranking officials, was Mira Solis, the princess of the Leonid people. Her presence in the arena wasn't just that of royalty. She was a fighter, a warrior in her own right, and Dante couldn't help but feel her eyes on him. He tried to focus on the battle before him, but Mira's gaze lingered in his mind, distracting him. She was no ordinary princess. She had seen through the facade of other fighters before, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was doing the same with him. Her sharp, observant eyes, Her quiet yet overwhelming presence sent a wave of unease through him. With every swing of his opponent's weapons, Dante could feel the weight of Mira's gaze growing heavier. Was she watching him out of curiosity? Or was she waiting for him to fail? "Focus, Dante," he whispered to himself, dodging another swipe from the Orion Champion. But his mind kept drifting back to her. The way she stood with such regal composure, the way her silver tail flicked in time with the crowd's rhythm. She was a perfect picture of control, of power, something he could never pretend to be. The fight continued, but it felt like he was moving through water, slower, clumsier with every step. The more he fought, the more he realized how out of his depth he truly was. And the more he realized that Mira was watching him, silently judging, silently waiting. He couldn't let her see the truth. Not now, not when he was so close to getting everything he'd wanted. But then, during a brief lull in the battle, he heard her voice. "That was impressive," Mira said, her voice cutting through the noise of the arena like a blade. Her words were not a compliment, but an observation, one that seemed to carry the weight of something deeper. Dante's heart skipped. He hadn't even realized she was standing near the edge of the arena now, watching him with those piercing eyes. He couldn't decide whether it was her presence that unnerved him more, or the fact that she could probably see right through him. Her gaze softened just a fraction, and she leaned forward slightly. "You're not what you seem," she said, her words laced with an understanding that made Dante's stomach churn. Dante could barely keep his footing as the Orion Champion launched another brutal series of attacks. He ducked and dodged, but it felt more like luck than skill. His body ached with every movement, and the raw fear that had been bubbling beneath the surface for so long was now overwhelming him. This fight was different. There was no deception here. The audience might be fooled, but the Orion Champion wasn't. He could feel it. The champion was toying with him, waiting for the right moment to end the match. For a moment, Dante's thoughts wandered to Mira again. He had caught glimpses of her in the royal box during the battle. Her eyes never left him. She was studying him, analyzing every move. He felt like a specimen under her gaze, and he hated it. She wasn't just watching for sport, she was trying to figure him out. And Dante had spent his entire life running from the truth. The idea that Mira, of all people, might be able to see through him made his stomach twist. With a grunt, Dante narrowly avoided a deadly swipe from the Orion Champion's sword. He rolled to the side, breathing heavily. The crowd's cheers rang in his ears, but they felt distant now, like they belonged to someone else. The adrenaline of the fight was no longer enough to push away the gnawing guilt. "You're not a warrior," the Orion Champion taunted, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're a joke." Dante froze, his chest tightening at the words. They hit harder than any of the champion's strikes. For a moment, he could hear nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat. Was he really a joke? All this time, he had been running from his past, from the truth, pretending to be someone he wasn't. But now, facing the Orion Champion, the lie felt impossible to maintain. Orion's voice broke through his thoughts, cold and emotionless. "Dante, if you continue this charade, your chances of survival drop to 36%. You cannot keep pretending. You must fight for real or be exposed." Dante clenched his fists, a wave of anger washing over him. "I don't have a choice," he muttered to himself, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I never had a choice." In that moment, a spark of clarity hit him. The only way out of this was to stop pretending. The fight was no longer about winning the tournament or securing the prize. It was about redemption. It was about proving to himself and to the people watching that he was more than the conman he had been, that he could fight like a real warrior, even if it was too late to change everything. With newfound resolve, Dante surged forward, meeting the Orion Champion's next strike with surprising speed. The battle raged on, but this time, Dante wasn't dodging to survive. He was fighting for something more. As the match continued, Dante's fight with the Orion Champion became less about the battle itself and more about his internal struggle. The more he pushed himself, the more he realized that the deception he had woven was unraveling, not just with his opponent, but with everyone who watched him, especially Mira Solis. After a brutal exchange of blows, the Orion Champion finally stepped back, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Dante. "Not bad for a fraud," he said, sneering. But you can't hide forever. Dante, breathing heavily, was about to retort when he caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye. Mira, standing at the edge of the royal box. Her sharp eyes were locked on him, her expression unreadable. For a split second their gazes met, and Dante felt a jolt of fear. Her presence, once just a distant observation, was now like a weight on his shoulders. He couldn't escape her gaze. He could feel her judgment, her scrutiny. Mira wasn't just watching the fight, she was watching him. Her awareness of him, her ability to read him, was more intense than he had realized. But before he could think further, the match took another turn. The loud crack of the arena's PA system echoed through the space. The lights dimmed, and the voice of the announcer boomed over the speakers. Attention! A special message from the tournament officials. There have been reports of suspicious activity regarding several contestants. Effective immediately, all fighters will be subject to additional scans and investigations. Any signs of corruption, deception, or manipulation will result in disqualification and punishment. Dante's heart skipped a beat. The announcement was directed at him. He knew he couldn't avoid the scrutiny for much longer. Mira's eyes flicked to the announcer's booth, then back to him. She knew something was up. Her piercing gaze told him that she wasn't going to let this go unnoticed. His pulse raced as he felt the walls closing in around him. The hidden forces in play, the officials, the watchers, the people behind the scenes were all closing in. Mira might be his only chance for survival, but could he trust her? Could she be the one to help him, or would she expose him for what he really was? The Orion Champion advanced again, his eyes glinting with amusement. "You're finished," he sneered, preparing for a final strike. But Dante didn't move. He didn't dodge this time. He was no longer just fighting for survival. The crowd's roar faded into the background as Dante stood, gasping for breath, facing the Orion Champion. His body ached, every muscle screaming in protest, but his mind was clear for the first time since he'd entered the tournament. The fight had been brutal. His opponent was a powerhouse, and he had only just barely held his ground. But in the moment of chaos, when everything seemed to be falling apart, Dante realized something. This wasn't just about survival. It was about facing his own truth. He hadn't fought like a warrior before, but now he was starting to understand what it meant. It wasn't about deceiving others or hiding behind a mask. It was about confronting himself, his choices, his lies. The Orion Champion, sensing his hesitation, took another step forward, ready for the final strike. But this time, Dante stood his ground. The weapon came crashing down, faster than he could react, but just as it reached him, a shout echoed across the arena. "Stop!" It wasn't the voice of an official or an announcer. It was Mira Solis. She had left the royal box and was now standing at the edge of the arena, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the stadium. Her sharp eyes locked onto Dante, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world held its breath. The Orion Champion paused, his weapon raised but not striking, as Mira's voice rang out again. "This match is over," she declared, her voice carrying with a sense of finality that cut through the tension in the air. Dante turned slowly to face her, his heart pounding. The crowd was silent, confused, unsure of what was happening. Mira's gaze didn't waver as she walked toward him, her silver tail trailing behind her, moving with purpose. She reached him just as the tension in the arena reached its peak. "Mira." Dante's voice cracked, a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. "What are you doing?" She looked at him with those piercing green eyes, her expression unreadable for a moment, before softening slightly. "You don't have to keep pretending, Dante." The words hit him harder than any blow he had taken in the arena. He had expected Mira to expose him, to reveal his deception to the world. But instead, she was offering him something he hadn't even considered: understanding. Mira took a step closer, her presence overwhelming yet comforting. "I know what you're doing. I see the lies you've built up around yourself, but you don't have to carry them alone anymore." She paused, her gaze shifting slightly as if weighing her next words carefully. "I know what it's like to hide behind a mask, to live up to expectations that aren't your own. But I've learned it's better to face the truth." Dante stood frozen, unsure how to respond. He had never been good at letting people in, at letting anyone see the man he was beneath the facade. For years, he had built walls around himself to keep the world at bay. And now, here was Mira, challenging everything he had ever known about himself. She was right, though. He was tired of running, tired of hiding. Maybe it was time to stop pretending. Why? Why are you doing this for me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mira's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Because sometimes the universe puts us in strange places, Dante. It's not always about who we were, but who we could become. She stepped closer, her voice softening. You don't have to do this alone. Dante's heart pounded in his chest as he looked into her eyes, feeling a connection he hadn't expected. This wasn't about her royal status, her strength as a fighter, or her noble bloodline. It was about the person standing in front of him, the one who saw beyond the lies and the masks, the one who offered him a chance to change. In that moment, everything shifted. For the first time since entering the tournament, Dante felt the weight of his choices, not as a burden, but as a possibility. He could continue down the path of deception, keep running from the truth, or he could take a chance, face what he had been avoiding for so long, and let someone else in. I don't know if I'm ready, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mira nodded, understanding. You don't have to be, you just have to be willing to try. Dante swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in his chest. He had spent so long convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that he could control his fate with lies. But standing here, with Mira's steady gaze fixed on him, he knew the truth. He couldn't keep running forever. The crowd began to murmur, but it felt distant, like a background noise to the silent conversation unfolding between them. Mira turned to the Orion Champion, her voice commanding. The match is over. There will be no further violence. The Orion Champion grunted in frustration but lowered his weapons, acknowledging Mira's command with a reluctant nod. Mira turned back to Dante. We should go, she said softly, offering him her hand. Dante looked at her for a long moment, then finally took her hand, the weight of his decision settling in. This was the moment where everything could change. The moment he stopped running, stopped hiding, and started facing the truth. The final match had arrived. The roar of the crowd was deafening as Dante stepped onto the arena floor, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, the officials, the fighters, and most importantly, Mira. She was in the royal box again, her sharp green eyes fixed on him. Every movement he made felt scrutinized. For the first time, Dante wasn't just fighting for money, for the brotherhood. He was fighting for his soul. Across from him stood his opponent, the last barrier between him and victory, Grax, the undefeated warrior from the depths of the Orion sector. Grax was a legend, known for his brutal style and unmatched strength. He towered over Dante, his 6 arms each holding a different weapon, each one gleaming with lethal precision. The crowd had already declared him the victor, their chants echoing through the arena. But Dante wasn't listening to them. He was focused, not on the fight itself, but on what he had to prove to himself. No more lies, no more pretending to be someone he wasn't. It was time to face the truth. The crowd gasped, the sound rippling through the arena like a wave. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Grax, the indomitable champion, staggered backward, his eyes wide in disbelief. He had never been hit like that before. Dante stood there, chest heaving with effort, his body screaming in protest, but his mind was clear. For the first time since stepping foot into Zantar 5, he felt like he was truly in control. Grax growled, his anger rising, but he quickly recovered. His 6 arms, each one holding a different weapon, adjusted their position as he glared at Dante with renewed fury. You've earned my respect, he spat, but it won't save you. Dante wiped the sweat from his brow, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had just landed a blow, but Grax was far from finished. He had to keep going, keep pushing. This fight was about more than just winning. It was about redemption, about proving to himself that he wasn't the man he used to be. Grax charged again, this time with even more fury. His 6 arms swung in a brutal flurry of attacks. Dante barely managed to dodge the first strike, but the force of Grax's fist sent him tumbling backward. He gritted his teeth, rolling with the momentum and quickly springing to his feet. His limbs were sore, his energy running low, but he couldn't afford to stop. Not now. You can't keep dodging forever, Grax sneered, his voice dripping with malice. But this time, Dante didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He was no longer pretending to be someone he wasn't. He was fighting for his life, for his truth, and for the chance to be the man Mira had seen in him. As Grax lunged again, Dante took a step back, but this time, instead of retreating, he countered. He dodged under one of Grax's sweeping blows, and with a surge of energy, slammed his fist into Grax's midsection. The move was swift, precise, and powerful, much more than a lucky strike. Grax gasped, the breath knocked out of him. He staggered, stumbling back, his hands clutching his side. The crowd roared, disbelief spreading through the stands. Dante, breathless but determined, stayed on his feet. Grax glared at him, fury flashing in his eyes, but Dante stood tall, unyielding. This time, it wasn't just about the fight. It was about proving that even a man who had built his life on lies could change. He wasn't running anymore. The Orion Champion's grip on his weapons tightened. He lunged forward once more, but this time, Dante was ready. The final test had arrived, and he wasn't going to back down. The moment felt surreal. Grax, the mighty warrior who had never been defeated, was staggering back. The arena was silent, the crowd waiting for the next move. For a split second, it felt like time had stopped. Dante's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving from the exhaustion of the battle. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He was free. For the first time, he realized that it wasn't just about the fight. It was about who he was becoming. Grax's eyes narrowed as he regained his stance, his pride taking a hit from the unexpected blow. He charged forward again, his weapons raised, ready to end the fight. Dante braced himself, but this time, he was ready. He had faced the truth about himself and had embraced it. No more running, no more lies. But before the final blow could be struck, a voice rang out, cutting through the tension. Enough! The arena fell into a stunned silence as Mira Solis descended from the royal box, her figure commanding and regal. She was no longer the princess watching from afar. She was a warrior, standing at the edge of the battlefield. Her silver tail flicked behind her as she stepped forward, her eyes locked on Dante, her gaze unwavering. Stop this, she commanded, her voice carrying the weight of authority. The crowd fell silent as Mira approached the center of the arena, her presence dominating the space. Grax hesitated, his weapon still raised. Mira turned to him, her gaze sharp. This fight is over. Dante has proven himself. The tournament is not just about strength, it is about the heart of a warrior. And this man, she said, turning to Dante, has shown that he possesses that heart. Dante's eyes locked onto Mira's, and in that moment, the weight of everything he had been carrying lifted. He had done it, not just for the victory, but for the truth. Mira had seen it all. She knew him, perhaps better than he knew himself, and she had chosen to stand with him. The crowd erupted into applause, but Dante couldn't hear them. All he could hear was Mira's voice, steady and strong, echoing in his mind. Dante stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Mira. She was the reason he had fought this battle, not for the riches, not for the glory, but for a chance to be something more, a chance to be real. He reached out, taking her hand, and for the first time he didn't feel like a fraud. He didn't feel like a con man. He felt like a man who had fought and won, not just in the arena, but in the battle for his own soul. The deafening roar of the crowd slowly faded as Dante stood in the arena, still gripping Mira's hand, his heart racing. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the battle was slowly wearing off, leaving him exhausted, but with a strange sense of calm. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from anything. He wasn't trying to escape the truth or deceive anyone. He had stood in the arena, faced the greatest challenge of his life, and he had done it honestly. But there was something else now, something deeper than the fleeting exhilaration of victory. He could feel the weight of the choice he had made hanging over him. This wasn't just about proving himself as a fighter. It was about proving he could be better, that he could rise above the man he had been. But the truth, as always, was complicated. As Mira pulled him off the battlefield and toward the edge of the arena, Dante could see the officials gathering, murmuring in the stands. A sudden tension filled the air again. Mira's gaze flicked toward the royal box where her father, the High Counselor, stood. His expression was unreadable, but Dante could feel the weight of his scrutiny. Dante swallowed hard, realizing that this moment, his redemption, came with consequences. The deception had been exposed, and now the cost of his past would come due. He couldn't escape the repercussions, no matter how much he had changed in the last few moments. "Mira," he said, voice low, his chest tightening. "What happens now?" Mira didn't immediately answer. She kept her eyes on the High Counselor and the officials, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned to Dante, her gaze softening just a little. "There are consequences for your actions, Dante, but I'll make sure you're not left to face them alone. You've shown courage, something I thought was long gone in this place." She paused, her gaze holding his, the unspoken understanding passing between them. "But you need to make a choice. The future isn't just about fighting anymore. It's about who you choose to be." Dante's mind raced. He knew what she meant. He couldn't just keep running from his past forever. He had to choose whether to embrace the man he had become or return to his old ways, his lies, his cons, the world that had shaped him. It was the hardest decision he had ever made, but for the first time, he didn't feel trapped. He wasn't choosing between survival and deception. He was choosing between a future with purpose or a return to his old life. And for the first time in years, he chose the truth. "I choose to fight for the right reasons," Dante said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on Mira's. "I've lived my life in the shadows long enough. It's time to step into the light." Mira's eyes softened, a small, approving smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Then let's make sure you stay in the light." As they walked off the arena floor, Dante could feel the shift within him. The crowd was still cheering, but he knew that the loudest applause would come from within himself. He had just made the choice to face the truth, no matter what came next. The tension that had once consumed Dante now seemed to dissipate as he stepped into the quiet, waiting room behind the arena. Mira stayed by his side, the two of them now separated from the chaos and noise of the arena. Her presence was calming, but there was still an unspoken weight in the air, the aftermath of everything that had just transpired. Dante collapsed onto a bench, wiping the sweat from his forehead. His limbs ached, and his mind felt like it was spinning with everything that had happened. But there was a sense of clarity in his chest, an awareness that everything he had done up until this point was leading him here. He had made it through the tournament, yes, but more importantly, he had made it through to the truth. Mira sat down beside him, her silver tail curling around her as she leaned back against the wall. "You're not the man you were when you entered this tournament," she said softly, her voice warm with approval. "You fought not just for victory, but for something more." Dante smiled weakly, his eyes meeting hers. "I didn't realize what I was fighting for until the last moment, but now, I see it. I see what I need to do." Mira tilted her head slightly, her expression gentle. "You found your purpose." "I found a path, at least," Dante replied, his voice steady. "I don't know what comes next, but I do know I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding who I am, and I'm ready to face whatever comes." There was a long silence between them, filled only with the distant sounds of the arena still echoing in the background. Mira broke it with a soft chuckle. "I think we both have a lot of changes ahead of us." Dante nodded. "Yeah, but for the first time in a long while, I think I'm ready." The door to the waiting room opened, and a familiar figure entered, the High Counselor, Mira's father. His stern face softened slightly when he saw them sitting together, and despite the serious atmosphere, there was a hint of pride in his eyes. "Mira," he began, his voice stern but not unkind, "I hope you understand the weight of this decision. Dante is no longer the man who walked into this arena, but we will see if this new path will be enough to redeem him." Dante stood, facing the High Counselor, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew this was where the journey truly began. "I'll prove I'm more than my past," Dante said, his voice unwavering. "I've made mistakes, but I'm ready to make things right." The High Counselor studied him for a long moment before giving a slight nod. "We will see, Dante. We will see." As he turned and left the room, Mira looked at Dante, her eyes full of quiet encouragement. She had given him a chance to change, to become someone different, and he wasn't going to waste it. Dante smiled, a real smile this time, as he turned toward the future, not knowing what lay ahead, but ready to face it head on.